The program you're about to see was presented at a banquet sponsored by the Tuolumne Historical Railroad Association on April the 20th, 2024. THRA is a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the fascinating history of all the railroads in Tuolumne County, California. The banquet was part of a Tuolumne Railroad Weekend, which also included the West Side Reunion and the Sierra Railway Seminar. For more information about THRA and the Tuolumne Railroad Weekend, go to www.tuolumnerailroad.org. The featured speaker is Scott McGhee, General Manager of the Yosemite Mountain Sugar Pine Railroad in Fish Camp, California, www.YMSPRR.com.
Good evening. How are we doing today? My name is Scott McGhee, as Glenn mentioned, General Manager at the Yosemite Mountain Sugar Pine Railroad. I've been at the railroad off and on for over 30 years, been the General Manager for the last 5. I can tell you what I've learned in 5 years makes my head spin. We'll see how it does with you also. Just want to read the room a little bit. I know that we're in here because we have several common interests. I give lots of speaking to community groups and organizations, our local historical society. Not a lot of trained people. You're my people. I don't have to explain what a Shay is. You know what a Shay is. You understand what a narrow gauge train is. We've got a commonality interest in history and railroads and steam trains. The West Side. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to poll you anyway. We have 2 Shay locomotives that belong to the West Side Lumber Company. We have the number 10 and the number 15. If you're a fan of the West Side, you have a favorite. And I know which one it is, but I'm just going to poll you anyway just to see it. If the number 10 is your favorite, raise your hand. If the number 15 is your favorite, raise your hand. Oh, not as big as I thought it was going to be. But, yeah, there you go. Thanks, Frank. You know, both of those engines have their own unique personalities and characteristics. When I tell people I work at a railroad and they work with trains, and they're just like, oh, like Thomas. And I said, no, not like Thomas. And I said, oh, we carry passengers. And they said, oh, like Amtrak. And I said, well, you know, we're kind of. You know, and then they say, you know, we're going to do a speak, you know, for some modelers, you know. And they go, oh, yeah, toy trains like Y&L, like around the trees. And well, not quite. You know, we have a railroad, you know. Oh, and then some people, you know, they know a little bit about freight railroads. Oh, Union Pacific. And they say have a steam engine, and then there's this big one that's going around. Oh, it's like the big boy. Well, it's steam. You know, honestly, when I can tell people what I do and they can kind of get it, as they said, we're kind of like Disneyland. You know, it's steam, it's narrow gauge. We have a narrated tour. We go about the same speed. The similarities end there, you know, between us and Disneyland. But that's, you know, kind of the world that we live in up at the railroad. This is kind of the things I want to talk about today. Little history, some individual characteristics of locomotives, some major rebuilds. Without getting too technical, Glenn gave me a shot clock on how much time I have, and I'm already in 2 minutes and 54 seconds into this presentation. So we'll see what I can get done. Q&A at this time. Afterwards, after the raffle, I'll be around. Also be around tomorrow morning too. Some recent discoveries, some bonus features, and just a chance for questions. March 1925, Pickering Lumber purchased the West Side. And I want to make my little note right here. I understand that there are fact checkers in the room. I would love to hear with you afterwards, you know, on all the things that I said may be right or may not be right. And there's some things that I will present that I really don't know what the right answer is, but I'm just going through some information that's there. Hopefully I can bring in some information that would be wonderful for you. And George, go ahead and heckle me anytime you want to. Just a few things that happened. The stock market crash in 1929. The 10 was actually built the year before that happened. Was being operated by Pickering. The West Side people retook over West Side in July 1934. Here's where it gets weird, and I put question marks out of it because I literally looked at 7 different books and got 5 different answers. When did the 14 and 15 get purchased by the Hobart Estate Company, And when did the Swain purchase happen for the West Side? They all seem to agree that 1940 was the number that all of the skeleton cars and the 12 came over from Swain. But what doesn't make sense to me is how in 1939 they purchased 2 locomotives from a state that had gone under, and they numbered them 14 and 15 when they didn't have a 12. And the 12 happened a year later. So it seems like to me that that should have happened, one after the other. Anyway, something to think about. I have that one picture that's on there that just kind of shows you what the West Side was doing. You look in 1928, they were operating 52 and a half miles of main line, and it keeps the same year, Camp 36 was 48 miles and 55 miles. The West Side was a big railroad during this time. They needed extra equipment to get up and down the hill. The interesting thing about the 10, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but these were big locomotives that they were purchasing to travel the whole railroad. 1965, we bought the first Shay from the West Side and brought it to Fish Camp to operate our railroad. We also purchased the last Shay to leave the West Side property in 1986 in the 15. Some other things that's really interesting to know that was going on at the same time is what Lima was doing at this exact period between when the 15 was built to all the way till 1930. In 1922, Lima was already kind of faced with the fact that their direct or rod locomotives were the majority of their business, and the Shays were not. But Lima's always been a company that focused on customers. They were a machine works. That's how M. from Shay got his original castings made. They were very customer focused. So even though in 1923, the Shay business was only 4% of their entire thing, they were still running with it. In fact, in 1922, they built their own shop to actually build Shay locomotives. The red line is the Shay production. The blue line is the direct locomotive production. 1923, they had 324 direct locomotives to only 49 Shays. I did a little statistics with some of those numbers just to see what those would be in 2024 dollars. We're looking at about the direct profit in 1923, about $183,000. Shay profit was about 50 grand. It's interesting that the 10 even got built when you look at this graph, because if they just looked at a business and said, you know what, we're not going to make in Shays anymore, the money's in rod engines. And part of that is the Shays, when they were built, they were very customized. The customer could say, I want oil, or I want wood, or I want narrow gauge, or I want 36-inch drivers or 32-inch drivers, and I want, this gear ratio. And they would build it for them. Whereas the Spokane, Portland, Seattle would say, I need 50 210-2s. Can you build those for me? All right, done. That's why there was so much more money in the direct locomotives than the Shays, but they were still building them. In fact, they built them all the way to the fact when the market really disappeared after the stock market crash. Towards the end of the production at Lima, they were building the Pacific Coast Shay, and the Pacific Coast Shay was kind of a big standard gauge locomotive. Pickering had a few of them, for those people that know about the Pickering. It was a standardized locomotive. It was a Shay that was built a certain way. And it was always interesting to me on why they would build the Pacific Coast as a standard locomotive when everything else was so customized. This chart actually explains it. The orders weren't there for the Shays, so they just put their guys to work building Shays. And somebody called up and said, hey, I need a Shay. It's like, hey, I got a Shay. Here you go. And so they were sending out things that were already produced. And so the turnaround time was fairly quickly. The number 10, construction number 3315, bought at a price of $23,415. Interesting enough, the number 9 was purchased 6 years earlier, more expensive than what the number 10 was, and that's a bigger locomotive. This was the first West Side engine in the new Pickering owners, and it was lettered with the Pickering Lumber Company logos and everything on it. If they had to buy that train in 2024, $23,000 would be over $420,000 right there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this locomotive and these logos and colors and everything, but it's neat to look at this. This is a builder's photo outside the Lima plant. Here's some pictures of the 10 in operation. You can see the 10 was really taking the logs from the camps to the mill. And you can see a couple pictures going across the bridge, coming down the mountain, and then sitting there at the dispatcher's office. And then there was the 10 in after 1961, just before we had purchased it. They hadn't yet stolen the number 10 off the front of it yet. That still happens before we acquire the locomotive. They did take the Shay plate off of underneath the 10 on the cab. As you can see, it's missing there. And the whistle came off it almost immediately. Still looks pretty good. And then there's the 15, originally purchased by the Sierra Nevada Wood Lumber Company as their number 9, delivered in May 1913. There's a proud crew standing on next to that locomotive. If that's the same, if that picture was taken prior to this, one of those people are no longer with us. August 21st, 1915, Little Truckee River, a bad bent on the trestle, and the engine went all the way down to the bottom, destroyed the cab, and they rebuilt it into a wood cab. There was a hostler fireman on his very first trip, and he perished in that accident. The locomotive to this day still has a lean to it from this. The 2 water glasses on side of it, one side rides higher than the other one, because of the lift on it. That's about the only issue that we can see. 1939, it was sold to the West Side. Again, question mark. Here's a picture of the 15 as the number 9 sitting on the flat car. And the West Side numbered it 15. I'm not sure exactly why they numbered it 15. Obviously, you can't have 2 9s on the roster, and they had a number 9. I'm going to come back to this picture in a moment, but I'm going to show you, this chart has always driven me crazy. I'm a numbers person. Things have to have order and sense. This makes no sense to me. We have construction number 2645. We have 2835. One's built in 1913. One's built in 1916. Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber numbered at 9, numbered at 10, but the West Side switched the numbers. Why? Of course, the books don't talk about that.
It was bought as a parts engine, and then they decided to build it to operate.
What's that?
The West Side. The West Side bought it as a parts engine.
Bought it as a parts engine.
And
then they decided to run it.
Yeah.
They didn't really wanted it.
They really wanted it.
Scrapper, they wanted the 14. Scrapper said, what about this one? Yeah, we don't need that. It's, well, no, it's a different. Such a deal, I'm gonna make it. They bought it for $200.
$200. All right.
So, in the West Side accounting records, the 14 was bought on May 9th. It hit the books.
See, I told you there were fact checkers in the room.
For $1,236 plus freight of $340. The 15 was bought in December of 41 for $566 plus $340 of freight.
All right. Here's the interesting thing on the 15. We're working with a graphic artist, which I'll talk a little bit later, and we're looking at numbering styles and everything. The number 9 was painted over, grounded out, they hand painted on there. And when I was talking to the artist, he says, look, you can still see the 6. And I said, that's not a 6, that's a 9 that's been flipped upside down. I've never noticed this before. This is like a recent discovery in the last month that when they put that plate on there, again, a scrap locomotive they never intended running, probably some joker thought, hey, let's make it number 6 and replace the 6 that had been running. And they said, oh no, we're not doing that. We're going to paint it out and put a 15 on it. But that plate has always been upside down. And if you look closely in this photograph, you can see the highlight of the 6 right inside there. The 6 is a very documented history about leaving the rails. There's been lots of reasons on why that could be, and the engine is top heavy. I think they're running the locomotive too fast. But whatever the reason was, they had issues with that. Westside actually tried to get a 3-truck Heisler made, and Heisler wouldn't make a narrow gauge one, so they were looking to Shays and through a trade with the 7, and 7 turned out pretty good that they ended up purchasing their own. But I thought this is an interesting photograph with seeing the 6 ghost right there, right behind the 15. So here's our two characteristics of our two locomotives, the 10 and the 15. You can see them side by side right out over there. The interesting thing that I don't really understand why, but the wheel diameter of 34 inches is actually quite rare if you look at the Lima building records of the Shays. They were either 32 or 36, but having a 34-inch diameter. In fact, the last Shay that was made with a 34-inch diameter was the 9. And then I thought maybe they're doing it because they're trying to be consistent on tires and parts and everything. And then you look at the 8 and it's got 32-inch ridge. It's like, well, there goes that. I have a feeling it has more to do with the gear ratio and the wheels and giving more traction over that way. But it was definitely an oddball for Lima because they were building 32 and 36s. They have some 30 inches, but 34 was rare. The 10 has a larger fuel capacity and water capacity. It's also a heavier locomotive and superheated. The 10's there on the right, 15's looking right over there. Now you get to see them side by side. There they are. So the 10's up on top, 15 on bottom. That's the superheater pipe. You can tell a superheater locomotive by the location of that pipe. Notice that on the 15, I'll make a circle around over there. That pipe, that's the external steam pipe that goes from the dry pipe into the cylinders. On a saturated locomotive, it comes directly from the throttle stand into the cylinders, as you see on the 15. But on the 10, because it's superheated, the dry pipe is actually inside the locomotive, goes to a chest, heats up all the steam, and then it comes out on the outside. So if you notice that external pipe on a Shay, then you can tell whether the locomotive is superheated or not. The other thing that's neat about the 10 versus the 15, it's a little bit difficult to see it, but if you notice right where that circle that I put where that external steam pipe is, that dome is the steam dome where the throttle is. The whistle, the safety valves, the monkey's tail is all located on top of that steam dome. So if you have to go and adjust the throttle, all of those parts have to come off. But on the 10, they got a little bit smarter. Notice that the steam dome is right there, and then just behind it, you'll notice they have a separate place for all the accessories. I've circled that on that. So the whistle, the safety valves and everything has got its own spot. So then if you have to get into the throttle, all you're doing is just taking the top of the dome off. You can get in there much easier. The 10 has the all-weather cab. A 15 cab is wooden, as you can see. There was a debate at the railroad for the longest time about whether the 15 was originally built as a wood burner. If you look at the oil tank of the 10, it's all part of the same cab and everything. But on the 15, the oil tank is actually sitting inside a bunker. And we're like, was it ever a wood burner? And they just retrofitted it to an oil tank? Question. The firebox on the 15, I can tell you, is much bigger than the firebox on the 10, which makes it think that maybe they had a bigger firebox because they're putting wood or coal or whatever inside of it and they need more grate area. But there's no evidence of grates on the 15. So the debate happened for a long time until I got a book on the Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company, and they converted all their locomotives to oil about 4 years before they bought that one. So when this engine came, it actually came in that configuration. And we have a feeling that when they were building them at Lima, they kind of made it so you could customize it either way. By the time they were building 10, they were building so few Shays that they just did everything all at once. Just some interesting things about those two locomotives. The number 10 on a typical trip will burn anywhere from 25 to 30 gallons of oil. The same trip, the 15 does between 50 and 60. So it's almost half the oil. The 10 will use on that same trip about 400 gallons of water. The 15 will use about 500 gallons of water. People ask me, what train are you running? I said, if the 10 is running, we're running the 10. It's a business decision. It's cheaper to run that locomotive. Plus, the 10 can pull anything that we throw behind it. The 15 dead in tow, the diesel dead in tow, every single car, all completely loaded. And the 10 is just pulling itself up the hill. That engine is incredibly power. We call the 10 the Cadillac. Now, which is the one that they all love to run? The 15. The 15 is a sports car. Because it doesn't have the superheated, it doesn't have all those pipes to go and travel before it goes. You pull that throttle and 15 says, let's go. And it just takes off and it has a really good response. We ran an 8-car train with the 15 last year. Never heard it bark as loud as it did, going up the hill. It definitely talks to you. And when you're riding up the hill in the 15, if we're standing next to each other, we can't have a conversation. Whereas we could have a complete dissertation in the 10. It's just so quiet and everything. They're different. They operate. Right now, we are working on putting in a new dry pipe on the 10s. The 10's out of service right now. We're running the 15 every single day. This picture from the 15 was just taken 2 days ago.
So is the difference in oil consumption because of the bigger firebox?
Question was, is the difference in the oil consumption due to the firebox? And it's actually the superheating. In the 15, the steam will actually enter the pistons at about 450 degrees. On the 10, it's over 600. And that hotter, drier steam is more power and less fuel to do it. The other thing about the 10 that we discovered, as I'll show you from this picture, when we talk about major rebuilds, for years, the serious West Side people hated us. I'm just going to come out and say it. I've seen all of the angry emails and everything. That locomotive never had that stack on it when it was at the West Side. You have done a horrible service to that locomotive. But my answer to that is I said, that locomotive has had that stack on it longer than it hasn't had that stack on it. Because we've actually had it that long, longer than the West Side had it. That stack, and then that picture in the lower corner there, when I first got to the railroad back in the 70s, that's what the 10 looked like. When they had painted it, it looked like a Disneyland locomotive. And that's the original West Side box that's right there. That's a toolbox, however. We had that sitting inside the shop until the nature took over. It's no longer on it. We actually want to put that box back on it. This is the last picture you're going to see of the number 10 with that stack on it because, while you go ahead and clap, thank you. There's an interesting story behind the stack. The Madera Sugar Pine, which is the railroad that ran in our area, the Madera had tracks all over the place. They were all wood-burning locomotives. We wanted to tell the Madera Sugar Pine history. Unfortunately, the Madera Sugar Pine locomotives were all scrapped. There was no evidence of those left over. And the 10 was pretty close to what the Madera Sugar Pine 6 looked like. The 12 actually would have been a better locomotive, but whatever, they got the 10. And we're happy they did. It's been a very good locomotive for us. With that stack on it, it looks pretty close to what the Madera 6 was, and they were built around the same time. However, we put new tires on the locomotive in 2016, and there's a hub on the wheel, and then you have to heat it up, and it gets shrunk on and everything. But when you put new tires on the locomotive, it gets taller. And it wouldn't get inside the engine house with that stack on it. Now, even though it was part of the Madera history and it's on our logo and all that kind of stuff, it was also a big view obstruction that was on there, but also that stack was causing that smoke box to be much hotter than it should be, and it was actually causing deterioration inside it. In fact, it was a challenge to fire the number 10 because of the stack, because it had its own atmosphere, its own heat and everything going on. We had to play tricks with firing the locomotive, because if you brought the locomotive in too hot, you couldn't keep it down. You couldn't put enough water in it just to keep it under control. So a mile before we got to the station, we started backing off on the boiler. Now on a steam locomotive, you can't just add water and decrease pressure, because every time you do that, the boiler is expanding and contracting on that. So you do it slowly. You give it a 10-pound drink, you watch the steam pressure drop down 10 pounds. When that happens, you let it come back 5 and then knock it down 10 again. And then let it come back 5 and then knock it down 10 again. If you could come into the yard about 160 pounds, you could keep the 10 at bay, where the point where it won't want to keep hitting at 200 pounds and setting the safety valves off. Now the 15 is a completely different animal. You could bring the 15 in at 200 pounds and you could go back to a spot and it would stand right there on 199. The 10, you wouldn't even think of trying that. You just couldn't do it. For years, we believed that the stack and we thought that superheater was the issue. It actually was the stack, because the second the stack came off, the 10 fired like the 15 is. I calculated that we were saving 30 to 35% in fuel costs by taking the stack off. To the point is that when we did the boiler rebuild a couple years ago, I had them cut all of the studs off, so that stack is never going back on the locomotive again. Things you learn because of things that happen. It's too tall, it won't go in the shop. Yeah, we could have cut a bigger notch, but it was like, we were looking for a good excuse to get rid of it, and there it was. One of the unique things that we had, and we're still trying to find, and if there's anybody in this room that knows where the patterns went from Glenn Bell's operation at Westside and Cherry Valley, please come and talk to me. We have a few patterns. The one over there on the lower corner out over that way is the original pattern for making a line shaft bearing. It's actually stamped Westside Lumber Company 8910 engine. And by having that wooden pattern, we can take it right to a foundry and get brand new ones made, which is exactly what we did. And so we have brand new line shaft bearings on both locomotives. We had some that were cast already from the 15, but these ones are from the 10. Some other things we've done, this is kind of what we do every year. Sometimes some people will stop by in the winter and they want to know what's going on, and they see all the line shafts off and everything is all apart, and they're like, oh my gosh, it's never going to run again. I said, no, this is normal. We take everything out. In the center there is what the axle bearing looks like. Those are a babbited bearing. We melt out the old babbit. We put in new babbit, cut in grooves so it can go over and put it back on the locomotive. Every year, in addition to all of this, and this gets done annually, we also take every valve off the locomotive and repack it and relap it and put it back on. We operate 8 months, sometimes 8.5 months. That engine's got to run every single day, and we want it to be reliable every single day. People want to come up and ride a steam train. When the steam train is down, the diesel has to run. They're just as mad at the diesel as the stack being on the locomotive. We retubed the locomotive, and we made the decision that when we're going to retube it, we're also going to replace the boiler jacket and then repaint the locomotive. And there was asbestos underneath the jacket. So when we took the jacket off, the hazmat, it was like the little radioactive suits were all coming out all over the place. They cordoned off the whole area and did all of that. Cost us about $12,000 to get all of that. We have now a little special 55-gallon drum of the asbestos off the number 10 that has our name on it with a little serial number. We also took the cylinder cover jackets off, and guess what? There's asbestos under those too. Guess what? They get to come back out, but the little white suits and all the little things. Another $5,000 there, you know. That was all done. The other thing that we did is that we replaced all of the boiler tubes in the locomotive. We're not under the FRA's jurisdiction. We're under the state of California's. Depending on the day and the inspector we're working with, you know, sometimes it's a good thing and sometimes it isn't a good thing. In 1991 was the last time the boiler tubes were replaced on the number 10. It was down for the entire season. We elected a couple years to not only replace the boiler tubes, but also to replace the superheater flues. So you're looking inside into the boiler there, and you can see the new tubes that are in there, but you can see in those big holes, that's where the superheaters are. And then there's a couple pictures that look back on the firebox, and you can see all the stay bolts up on top. I can tell you, this would have been a great time to evaluate the dry pipe. When everything was out of the boiler, when we were doing all the ultrasound testing, and we did the ultrasound testing on the dry pipe, you can see it in the top picture. See this little thing that's hanging down right here? That is what's the dry pipe, and that's comes from the throttle stand, it comes all the way through, and then it goes into a header piece that you'll see on the next slide. That pipe, we did all the ultrasound testing from the outside, and everything checked out, and everything looked good. But when we took off the superheater header, which now you can see looking at the front of the smoke box, the header is right there, and all these pipes that are coming down are the superheater pipes. When we took that header off, we actually saw there was some deterioration inside that dry pipe that we didn't like and had to replace it. It's a more challenging job when you can't get in there and work on it. You can still get in there, but it's just a more challenging job. Also on this slide, you can see over here on the left, we actually replaced that ring around the door. The other one had 4 cracks in it, so that's a brand new piece that we had made. This picture right here shows 4 different phases of the locomotive being painted. The first one shows the brand new stainless steel jacket. And remember that picture I showed you in Pickering that had the stainless steel jacket on? The shop guys were all lobbying to me to leave the stainless steel jacket on it. And I said, you know, if I leave that stainless steel jacket, you guys are going to be polishing that damn thing every single day. And it's going to get muddy and dirty and all of that. And so no, we painted it black. The other interesting thing about West Side, all of the tenders on the big locomotives had issues with leaking, so they flipped them over. And you can barely see it in this slide. I'm going to try to highlight it right there, but you can actually see right here, West Side Lumber Company written on there. And if you look closely, you can see West Side Lumber Company written upside down in the same space, right out over there. We sanded the locomotive all the way down to the base. There is absolutely no evidence that this engine was ever maroon or red. And that builder's photo that you looked at, I had so many people tell me that's a maroon locomotive with white lettering on it. And you can't tell, it's a black and white picture. But when we sanded all the way down, no evidence at all that there's any maroon that was on it. And all of the decoration that you noticed that was on the tender and the Pickering logo was yellow. And that was only a brief amount of time where that logo was on that locomotive. And they wouldn't have painted yellow on a maroon locomotive. They put yellow on a black locomotive. And that was kind of the definitive thing that engine never was maroon. But you can see it, engine got black and it looked better. But the fact that it was actually yellow and not white highlights on it was the reason why we kept the yellow stripes along it to nod from the Pickering days. Next slide, I've got the 15. Just come to the projects we've done on that. There's the tender separated from the locomotive. We had to do that because we had to take the center truck out to do some work on the beams and everything inside there. So you can notice there's nothing under. It's another one of those things when people come and look at it and went, oh my goodness, will it ever run again? It's like, oh yeah, it'll run this weekend. This is another thing that we started doing a number of years ago. This box of brass cylinders, what we call horn brasses, where that's circled on there is what we call the horn. It's where they connect up over there. Then there's a coupling ring that helps the Shay go around. That piece that's circled right there will become egg-shaped, and that's hardened steel over there, and it's very expensive to replace that entire thing. But what if you machine it down and make it true and then put a brass sleeve on it and let the brass sleeve wear out? And that's what we've been doing. And so we will get an order of these. They're all perfectly fit to all of the horns. We'll put the horns on side there. And then at the end of the season, we'll check to see if the tolerance is, if they're round enough that we can put it back together. If not, we throw the brass away, actually melt it down, get the money back. But we'll put a new brass on there and the horn still stays the same. And so we do that on both locomotives. Since we've replaced the line shaft brasses on the 10, this last year, we only had to do 6 of those. And there's a lot more than 6 horns on the locomotive. So a great preventative maintenance that we've done. A couple years ago, we did new pinion gears on the 15. Here's the pinions that are on that. We are actually looking at right now to getting new pinions cast for the entire locomotive and new gears on the axles too. Interesting enough, we did not have these. We have a lot of parts for the 10 when we had purchased that. We have very little for the 15, and we keep in touch with all the people that have the Shay locomotives. Well, Lindsay Ashby out in Colorado had 2 pinion gears off the 14 spare ones in a container out in Canyon City, and he put them on a truck and sent them to us. So those were actually spares from the 14 that we put on the 15. This last year, we replaced the line shaft on the rear truck. And it's interesting because Roaring Camp just broke theirs this last year. We had found some cracks that actually went all the way through and made the determination that the safest way to do it is actually to machine a new one. And you can see several photos in there that show that new line shaft being made. So the rear truck has a brand new line shaft. Recent discoveries. The picture, you'll see the yellow Pickering logo on the number 10. And then if you've got really good eyes, it's almost like looking at the Double Star up in the sky. You can actually still see the 9 on the back of the 15 between the sandboxes. So the picture on the left, the 9 is still there. And it's neat to see part of the history. If the light hits it just right, you can still see SN, Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber, just the initials on one side of the tender. We're hoping that when we repaint the 15 that we're going to get all of that history and then take photographs. Something that may make the West Side people unhappy, that Pickering logo we are going to put back on the 10. We have a graphic artist that's working on that for us, and we're going to put that on the tender. So both of those will be back on there. It'll look just like it did when it was delivered. We have about 75% of it that we got from drawings, and he's finishing up the rest. So my next project I want to talk about is recreating the number 10's lettering style. What a project. So we painted the locomotive, and it's always bothered me, the billboard, Yosemite Mountain, Sugar Pine Railroad, and the goofy number 10s that are on it. I really wanted to have the ability to take a picture of the number 10 in black and white and not be able to tell what year it is. Now the challenge is that Westside had a very unusual font. It was all hand-drawn, out there, and some stencils that they created themselves. And I really wanted to have the locomotive look exactly like the 10. Now, Russ Simpson sells decals, but he doesn't make any for this locomotive. And I could scale them up, but how big do you scale them so that you can make it correct? So I was doing a lot of research online, and I came across a guy on Etsy that was selling numerals from the West Side that you could put up in your room and everything. And I recognized the 2, and if you know what I'm talking about, it's this funky looking 2 that comes over that way. And I was like, this guy knows what he's doing. So I messaged him and I said, I would like to get some numbers, for like the number 10. And he says, oh yeah, I can do that. And I said, how did you get the 10 to look like the 10? He says, well, I looked at photographs and I looked at people and I was estimating their heights and estimating this, and I kind of figured out, and I was kind of going off it, the best that I could, and I came up with some pretty good things. And I said, what if you really knew what the dimensions were? And he says, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, what I want to do is I want to put the 10, the same size, back on the locomotive in the same exact spot. And he was like, oh. And then he got really excited. So he sent me these charts, and this is just one of about 8 different charts where he had done a scan of the cab, and is literally rivet counting. How far is it between that rivet and that rivet? How far is it from that rivet to that post? How far is it from that door out over to that way? And then you can see on the right side, write down all these dimensions. And then Kevin took all those dimensions. Some people wonder, is math ever going to be useful? Those are all individual calculations, all done by hand to get all of the scaling correct on the number 10. And here's some of the things, his original design, and then based on the new geometry orientation that is coming over. Here's some more scaling that he was doing to kind of count and do everything. Now putting in the real numbers that I've given him on what the dimensions are for everything. The next slide shows a little bit on how it's kind of coming out, and again, scaling it all through. There's like a little perspective up in the upper right-hand corner of coming up. The picture's never taken straight on. They're always on a little bit of an angle, up in a tree looking down. You can't get a 10 that's like perfectly out over that way. But through everything that we did pretty good. So there's the 10 working at Westside, and there's the 10 as it looks like today. I caught incredibly grief from my shop manager for this 10. Now, if you look at the 10 and you see the 0 next to the 1, you'll see there's a notch on the bottom of it. Now, if you look at the picture of the 10 over there in Tuolumne, you can see the same notch. He's an auto body guy. He's a number. He says that the 0 shouldn't have a notch in it. And I said, but it had the notch in it. He said, that's what it looked like. He said, but the 0's got to be perfect. And I said, well, it never was perfect. So I wanted to make it exactly like it was, and that's why I won, and that's why it's up there.
Are those vinyl decals?
They're painted on.
They are painted.
They're painted on, yeah. And I had a graphic artist that he had a machine and made big stencils and everything, and then stuck them right onto there, and then he went and outlined all of it, and then he pulled that off and then hand painted the numbers on there. That's hand painted on. It's gorgeous. There's the fireman's side, and you could see, because this was right after he did it, and you can see there's a little bit of spray and everything around the edges. It hasn't been cleaned up, but you can see how the 10, came out. And then, of course, we're not the West Side. We're the Yosemite Mountain Sugar Pine Railroad. But that looks a lot better than what was on there before. And the challenge with this is I wanted these letters to be the same side as West Side Lumber Company. And how do you get all of that? Well, about 5 years earlier, I had spoken to the people out at the Georgetown Loop. Maybe it was about 7 years earlier. And they had just completed the overhaul on the 9, and they had lettered it West Side Lumber Company, and they put the 9 on, and it looked gorgeous. And I asked them, I said, how did you guys get the letters correct? And they said, oh, when we were sanding it down, we actually got West Side Lumber Company, so we went and got stencils, and we traced everything, all of the letters. And I said, can I have a copy of that? And they said, no problem. They sent me all the stencils. So I've got West Side Lumber Company on the 9, but then I took the same stencils and I gave it to the graphic artist, and I said, okay, here's the font. Of course, it's not a font because those were all hand painted on. But I said, do your best to make Yosemite Mountain Sugar Pine Railroad look like the West Side Lumber Company. And that's what he came up with. I think it looks pretty good. And there's the finished product. The other thing that I don't show is the red pilot. How do you get the West Side red? And we had a model of the 15. We were looking at photographs. Of course, the photographs are hard to get the right thing. We talked to other railroads that had done the red, and we literally had about 17 different shades of red all the way laid out. And we finally picked one and said, this is probably the one that's going to work. And we painted on, I am not kidding you, it came out as pink as your shirt. And the guy that painted it, he's like, don't let Scott see this. Don't let Scott see it. But when it dried, it came out like that. And it looks good. Here's the fireman side of the locomotive. Turned out really nice. So here's our next project. We're going to letter the 15 like the 15. And we've already done all the measurements and everything. We've got the first preliminary. I want to stay on this slide for just a moment. This is a really good picture because it shows both styles of the 15. I've looked at hundreds of 15 pictures. If anybody has a picture of the square 5 on the rear of the locomotive, I really want to talk to you because I hate the rounded one, but I can't find any picture of it. Every picture of the rear always has the rounded 5. Notice that the 15 on the cab is square. And so here's kind of all the stuff that we've gone to, and there's the one graphic that shows the square 15 and the rounded 15 out on top. And it's like, even though I dislike the rounded 15, if that's what was on the back of it, then that's what it's going to get. The other thing about the 15 too, notice the fireman's picture right there, the black and white that's right there on that one side. Notice how the 15 is not centered on the cab. That really bugs me. But it's going to be that way when we get it painted. It's going to look just like that. And somebody's going to say, the 15's not centered. I'm like, it wasn't centered. That's what it looked like. Now, the other side, it is centered. But you can see it on the bottom over there. But on the fireman's side, it's not centered. And who knows why. All right, got some bonus features. I'm running out of time, so I was going to show some fun stuff. People wonder, do you ever run the locomotives together? We do sometimes. And sometimes we make the black smoke because the photographer thinks it's pretty. Really sets up the flues. This is a picture prior to the 10's paint job, and you can see the tender billboard lettering that I was talking about on the side. Hideous. And then we always do the little pose of the two locomotives in the loop, you know, next to each other. And then I can't go through it in a whole video without you actually seeing the train run. Nice view of the steps right there. The whistle is off a Southern Pacific Pacific class locomotive. And those are two West Side Skeletons. That's boxcar number 3, and then the other ones are ex-West Side flat cars. And then, of course, we've got the caboose on the end of the train. It used to be a camp car, and Bell actually restored it to this configure. It was never a caboose in revenue service, except for the West Side Cherry Valley. This is about a 4.5% grade right here. So it's not even as steep as over here, but you can hear the 15 really working. It looks like we're really close. We're not that close. See, the car is actually wet. It's pretty cold. They're all sitting on the covered cars today. Ta-da. Questions? Really? All right, yes.